What would you do if an ordinary night turned into your worst nightmare? Naomi Carter, a resilient single mother, only wanted to stop for gas after a long day at work. But in a town where justice belongs to those in power, she became the target. Instead, falsely accused, arrested, trapped in a system rotten to its core. And when it seemed like no one could help her, she made one phone call, the one she swore she'd never make again. Ryan Calloway, a former CIA operative, a man who didn't just know how to fight enemies, but how to bring down entire corrupt systems. But this time, the enemy wasn't a terrorist organization. It was the sheriff of this very town. Can Ryan dismantle the forces behind this web of corruption before Naomi loses everything? Or will that one call make things even worse? Stay until the very end, because this is only the beginning. The Atlanta sunset cast deep orange and indigo hues across the sky. The city buzzed with its usual energy, but inside Naomi Carter's law office, the air was thick with tension. She stood in front of a middle-aged woman whose eyes were red-rimmed, her hands trembling as she clutched Naomi's. "Thank you, Ms. Carter. If it weren't for you, I don't know what would have happened to my son." Her voice wavered, struggling to hold back tears. Naomi gave the woman's hand a reassuring squeeze, her gaze softening. Justice still exists, and we can't let them trample all over it. The woman nodded, eyes glistening, then turned and left. Naomi let out a slow breath, leaning against the edge of her desk. The weight of the day settled heavily on her shoulders. Cases of police brutality were never easy, not just because of the gaping flaws in the system, but because of the fear, the grief, the devastation that consumed the victims' families. She glanced at the clock, 6:35 p.m. Jordan was probably waiting outside by now. At the thought of her son, Naomi forced a small smile, pushing aside the heaviness clouding her mind. Stepping outside, she spotted Jordan sitting on the stone steps of the building. He wore his blue high school basketball jersey, clutching his worn Spalding ball. The moment he saw her, he sprang to his feet, his face lighting up with excitement. "Mom, I hit 3 three-pointers in a row today." The whole team cheered for me. Despite her exhaustion, Naomi laughed. She reached out, ruffling his short curls. "Really? Does that mean my son is about to be the next big NBA star?" Jordan shrugged, but his eyes gleamed with pride. "Just wait. Forget LeBron James. Jordan Carter is going to be the name everyone remembers." Naomi chuckled, adoring his confidence, his limitless dreams. But then, just for a second, that thought tightened something deep in her chest. How many black boys had dreams just like his, only to have them stolen away by a world that never played fair? She shook the thought off before it could consume her. Resting a hand on his back, she gently steered him toward the car. "Come on, future NBA star. Let's get home." Jordan hopped into the passenger seat, cradling his basketball. Naomi slid behind the wheel, shut the door, and started the engine. The familiar hum of her old sedan wrapped around her like a small comfort, a reminder of something stable in an unstable world. On the drive home, Jordan chattered excitedly about his practice, his voice filling the car, mingling with the distant sounds of traffic. Naomi listened, nodding along at the right moments, but her mind kept drifting back to the cases waiting on her desk. "You're not even listening, are you?" His voice snapped her out of it. Naomi glanced over, catching his curious gaze. "I'm sorry, baby. It's just been a long day." Jordan went quiet for a beat, then suddenly reached over and patted her shoulder. "You know you're the best, right?" Naomi let out a soft laugh. "Oh? What's with the compliments today? It's not a compliment. It's the truth. You help people. I know your job is really hard, but I also know you're fighting for what's right. Warmth spread through Naomi's chest. No matter how exhausting her work was, Jordan always had a way of making her forget the weight she carried. She reached over, squeezing his hand. I love you, Jordan. Love you too, Mom. The car rolled on through the Atlanta streets. A comfortable silence settled between them, the radio playing soft jazz in the background. Then Naomi noticed the gas gauge, nearly empty. She glanced at the dashboard, then turned into a small gas station off the road. She didn't know it yet, but the moment her car came to a stop, so did the life she knew. A small gas station, a stifling summer night. Naomi felt unease coiled tight in her chest. The patrol car behind her, flashing red and blue, wasn't just a routine stop. It was a warning, a threat. Beside her, Jordan clutched his basketball, his young eyes filled with worry. What's wrong, Mom? His voice was small, trembling. Naomi squeezed his hand gently, forcing a calm tone. It's okay, baby. Just a routine check. She was lying. Cops didn't pull over someone like her, a civil rights attorney, a woman who had dragged too many officers into court for abusing their power. And when she saw the two corrupt cops step out of the patrol car, Derek Walsh and Luke Grady, Naomi knew this wasn't random. They had been waiting for her. Walsh approached first, a smug smirk stretching across his face. Well, well. Good evening, Ms. Carter. He dragged out the words like he was savoring her name. Naomi said nothing. She knew how this game worked. Grady stood behind him, hand resting lazily on his holster, arrogance dripping from his stare. Walsh tilted his head. Your taillight's out. Naomi raised an eyebrow. That's funny. I checked it this morning. Walsh chuckled. Is that so? Why don't you step out so we can take a closer look? She had no choice. Taking a slow breath, Naomi opened the door. And in that split second, she made her move. Her hand slipped into her pocket, dialing a number, the only number that mattered. She didn't lift the phone to her ear. She didn't need to. It connected automatically. Every sound, every word, transmitted to the other end of the line. Walsh didn't notice. Grady didn't either. They only saw a woman standing tall, shoulders squared, refusing to cower. But she was afraid. Not for herself. For Jordan. All right, Walsh said, still smirking. Pop the trunk. Naomi crossed her arms. You don't have a warrant, Grady scoffed, stepping closer. And you think that matters? He yanked the trunk open without waiting for her consent. Then, well, would you look at that? Grady let out a slow whistle, lifting a small plastic bag filled with white powder. Jordan's mouth dropped open. That's not ours. Naomi's fists clenched. They had set her up. Walsh shook his head in mock disappointment. A civil rights attorney, running drugs? Now, that's ironic. Jordan fumbled for his phone. Crack. Grady ripped it from his hands and smashed it onto the pavement. Jordan froze, his entire body shaking. Walsh crouched, picking up the shattered pieces. Kids like you need to learn when to keep their mouths shut, Naomi snapped. You just broke the law. Her voice was ice. I will see you both in court. A deep, rumbling laugh filled the air. Naomi's blood ran cold. From the shadows, a black SUV rolled into the lot. The door swung open. Sheriff Hank Dawson stepped out. Slow, deliberate, savoring every second. He strolled toward her, eyes brimming, with contempt as he towered over her. "You think being a lawyer makes you untouchable?" Click. Handcuffs snapped around her wrists. Jordan screamed as they dragged her away. But Naomi couldn't hear him anymore. There was only one hope left. CDT, phone in her pocket, still connected. CIA training facility. Ryan set his coffee down, eyes unfocused as he stared at his laptop screen. The room was quiet. Then his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. An unknown number. Ryan didn't usually answer unknown calls, but something about this felt wrong. He picked up. The first thing he heard wasn't Naomi's voice. It was chaos. Jordan screaming, Naomi struggling, a man's cold, amused chuckle, the sharp snap of handcuffs locking into place. And then, "Mom!" The phone hit, the ground, a rustling sound. Then, silence. Ryan froze. His grip tightened around the phone. The room remained still, but inside him, a storm was already raging. He'd heard enough. No explanations needed, no further proof required. Naomi was in danger, and he knew exactly who was behind it. Ryan shot to his feet, grabbing his jacket and his gun. As the door slammed shut behind him, the game officially began. A rented SUV. 2:17 a.m., Ryan gripped the wheel, his gaze ice-cold as the digital clock on the dashboard flickered. He was in Atlanta. The call still echoed in his mind. Jordan's screams, Naomi struggling, the snap of handcuffs locking shut. He didn't know exactly what had happened. But one thing was clear. Naomi had been taken. And if Dawson was behind this, a simple arrest wasn't where it would end. Ryan needed a lead, and he knew exactly where to get it. A shady bar, the cops' playground. Purbu 2. Ryan killed the engine, staring at the flickering neon sign in front of him. The Blue Stallion, dingy little bar tucked away in a forgotten alley on the south side of Atlanta. The kind of place where men like Dawson and his crew came to celebrate their dirty victories. Ryan pulled his hoodie lower over his face and stepped inside. The stench of cheap whiskey and stale cigarettes clung to the air. Dim lighting, a few shadowy figures hunched over their drinks at the bar. He didn't need to look closely to know most of them were cops. Dirty cops. Ryan wasn't interested in any of them. Just one. At the far end of the bar, slumped over his glass of nearly empty whiskey, sat a middle-aged man with a bloated gut, sweat-slicked hair, and bloodshot eyes from too much alcohol and too little sleep. Ryan strode over and took the seat beside him. Holt barely lifted his head, squinting at him through the haze of liquor and exhaustion. "Who the hell are you?" Ryan didn't answer. Instead, he pulled a small knife from his pocket, turning it between his fingers. The blade gleamed under the dim bar lights. Holt stiffened. Ryan spoke, his voice low, cutting like steel. "Where is Naomi Carter?" Holt blinked, then let out a dry chuckle. "No idea what you're talking about." Ryan had no patience for this. He shot out a hand, grabbed Holt's wrist, and twisted. A sickening crack. Not enough to break it, just enough to send a message. This can go the easy way, or the painful way. Holt let out a strangled yelp, trying to jerk away, but Ryan's grip was iron. "Shit! I don't know anything!" Ryan tightened his hold. "You have 3 seconds." "Wait! Wait!" Holt gasped, panic setting in. Ryan didn't blink. 1. Holt writhed in agony. 2. Sweat trickled down Holt's forehead. Then, finally, he cracked. "She's not in lockup." Ryan didn't react, just stared. "Keep talking." Holt swallowed hard. Dawson has places, private ones, off the record. Ryan wrenched his wrist a little harder. Where? Holt nearly choked on the pain. An abandoned warehouse, south side, near the old industrial zone. Ryan slowly loosened. His grip. You sure? Holt nodded frantically, his face slick with sweat. I swear, I'm not part of this. I just overheard some guys at the station. They said Dawson wants her gone before the press gets wind of it. Ryan let go and stood. Holt cradled his wrist, panting, his face pale. He looked up, and for the first time, real fear flickered in his bloodshot eyes. Look, man, I don't want any part of this. His voice trembled. Ryan studied him for a long moment, then shrugged. You should have picked better friends. Then he turned and walked out of the bar. Atlanta's night sky was pitch black. On the outskirts of the city, far from the main roads, an abandoned warehouse stood alone in a barren lot, hidden behind dense, overgrown trees. No signs, no movement, just the faint glow of light seeping through a broken window and the heavy sound of footsteps echoing from within. Ryan Calloway pulled up about 500 meters away, switched off the headlights, and sat in silence. He didn't take her to jail. He has places for handling problems. Holt's words still rang in his head. Ryan had seen places like this before. Places where the law didn't exist. Places where people disappeared without a trace. His grip tightened on the steering wheel, eyes locked on the building. Naomi was in there, and he was getting her out. Inside the warehouse, the air was damp and cold, carrying the scent of rust and old gasoline. A single yellow light buzzed overhead, casting eerie, swaying shadows on the cracked concrete floor. Naomi sat in a rickety wooden chair, wrists bound with plastic zip ties, the skin around them raw and bleeding. In front of her, a rusted metal door stood slightly ajar, the muffled voices of two cops leaking through from the other side. I don't get why Dawson wants her kept alive for another night, one of them grumbled. Not our problem, the other muttered. We just watch her until he finishes the job. Naomi swallowed hard, her mind racing. The floor was covered in dust and splinters. On a nearby table, a discarded hunting knife lay among a mess of old papers. She couldn't wait for someone to rescue her. She had to save herself first. Taking a slow, steady breath, she inched her fingers toward the floor, blindly searching. Then, a sliver of glass. It could have been from a broken light bulb, maybe an old bottle. But right now, it was her only chance. Carefully, she pinched the shard between her fingers and began sawing at the zip ties. Seconds felt like hours. The voices outside grew louder. The glass bit into her skin, but she didn't stop. The plastic tie weakened. Just a little more. A sharp snap, her hands were free. Naomi sprang to her feet, snatched the knife off the table, and bolted for the door. But just as her fingers brushed the handle, it flew open. A cop stood on the other side, his eyes widening in shock. For just a split second before, his hand lunged for her. Naomi reacted on instinct. She swung the knife up, driving it into his arm. He roared in pain, stumbling back just enough to give her an opening. She ran, but before she could make it far, a rough hand yanked her backward. The second cop, "You little bitch," he snarled, slamming her to the floor. The knife slipped from her grasp. He twisted her wrist, his grip crushing. "Where the hell do you think you're going?" Naomi gritted her teeth, struggling, but he was stronger. Then, the lights went out. No warning, no sound. Total, suffocating darkness. For a single breath, everything was silent. Then, a thud, a strangled cry of pain. The cop holding Naomi stiffened. Another thud, a low groan, then the sound of a body hitting the floor. Naomi froze. The pressure on her wrist suddenly disappeared. She had no idea what was happening. Then, the light flickered back on, and she saw him. Ryan Calloway stood in the doorway, his arm still raised, from the blow he'd just delivered. The man who had grabbed her lay motionless at his feet. Naomi stared at him, her breath catching. It wasn't a hallucination. It wasn't a memory. It was Ryan, standing in front of her for the first time in 5 years. "Ryan!" Her voice broke, disbelief laced in every syllable. Ryan didn't answer immediately. His sharp gaze scanned her, checking for injuries. Then he stepped forward, grabbing her arm and pulling her to her feet. "We need to go," he said, voice low and firm. Naomi yanked her arm back, glaring at him. "What the hell are you doing here?" Ryan didn't get the chance to respond. A gunshot rang out from outside. "Someone's inside! Check the back!" Ryan clenched his jaw. He turned to Naomi. "No time! Move!" But she stood her ground, her eyes blazing with anger and suspicion. "Did you kill them?" she demanded. Ryan didn't blink. "If that's what it took to save you." Naomi's chest tightened. This was why she had left him 5 years ago. Because Ryan Calloway didn't hesitate to use violence. Because he believed justice could be dealt in blood. And now, after all this time, he was still that same man. But tonight, she didn't have a choice. Fisting her hands, she gave a tight nod. "Let's go." Ryan didn't wait. He grabbed her hand and pulled her into the night, leaving behind nothing but a warehouse full of bodies and 1,000 things left unsaid. The SUV tore through the night. Speeding down the deserted highway, Ryan gripped the wheel, his expression unreadable, eyes locked on the road ahead. Beside him, Naomi sat still, trying to steady her breath, her heart still hammering from their escape. Her wrists burned from the tight restraints, her mind still reeling from everything that had just happened. She turned to Ryan, her voice slightly shaky. "So, what now? We just keep running forever?" Ryan didn't glance at her. "No." His voice was firm. "We end this. Tonight." Naomi frowned. "What do you mean?" Ryan's grip tightened on the wheel. "All the evidence, Dawson's fake reports, his money laundering records, the list of dirty cops, it's all in his mansion." Naomi stiffened. "You're sure?" Ryan nodded. "An inside source confirmed it. If we want to take Dawson down, we need to get those files before he can erase them." Naomi bit her lip, breaking into Dawson's stronghold. It was suicide. But if those files existed, this was their only shot at exposing him. "You have a plan?" she asked, her voice steadier now. Ryan simply nodded and pressed harder on the gas. The SUV disappeared into the night. The final battle had begun. The fortress drizzle fell over Atlanta, turning the city into a blur of flickering streetlights and wet pavement. On the northern outskirts, Sheriff Hank Dawson's estate loomed in the darkness like an impenetrable fortress. 2 stories high, tall perimeter walls, surveillance cameras at every corner, armed guards patrolling non-stop. Ryan stopped the SUV about 500 meters away, killing the engine. They sat in silence, watching. Naomi swallowed. "How the hell are we getting in? Even cops don't have this much firepower." Ryan reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a Glock 19, screwing on a suppressor. The click echoed in the silence. He didn't need to answer. Naomi sighed. I don't like this. Ryan glanced at her, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. You never liked my methods. She clenched her jaw but didn't argue. Now wasn't the time for a debate on morality. They slipped out of the car, vanishing into the shadows. Inside the mansion, the guards moved in pairs, scanning the perimeter, fingers resting on their holstered weapons. At the front gate, one of them spoke into his radio. All clear. He never saw it coming. A muffled pop. His body stiffened, eyes wide. Then he crumpled, a bullet buried in his skull. His partner spun around, but a blade flashed through the dark, slicing clean across his throat. Blood sprayed. Ryan and Naomi stepped over the bodies without a word. Ryan knelt at the back entrance, pulling out a small electronic device. Within seconds, the lock clicked open. They slipped inside. The interior wasn't what Naomi expected. No grimy hideout. No crime den. It was pristine. Polished wooden floors. Expensive artwork. A carefully curated illusion of legitimacy. Dawson wasn't just corrupt. He was a businessman. A predator who knew how to hide in plain sight. Footsteps echoed down the hall. Ryan pushed Naomi into the shadows, both of them holding their breath. Two cops. Ryan whispered, I take the one on the right. You handle the left. Naomi shot him, a sharp look. You think I know how? But Ryan was already moving. In a blur, he struck the first man, crushing his throat with a single punch. The guard gasped, choking, then collapsed. The second man turned. Naomi panicked. She swung her gun, cracking it hard against his skull. He staggered, then dropped, unconscious. Ryan glanced at her, the corner of his mouth lifting slightly. Not bad. Naomi exhaled. I hate this. Ryan shrugged. We're almost done. They climbed the stairs, heading straight for Dawson's office. The door loomed ahead, the heart of his empire. Ryan placed a hand on the doorknob. Click. The sound came from behind them. They turned. 4 guns aimed directly at them. A smirking cop stepped forward. Welcome to hell. He didn't wait. The gunfire erupted. Ryan tackled Naomi to the ground as bullets tore through the hallway. Glass shattering, smoke filling the air. Rolling, he fired. 2 shots, 2 bodies down. Naomi ducked behind a desk, gripping her gun. A guard advanced. She aimed at his leg and pulled the trigger. He collapsed, screaming. Ryan took out the last man with a single shot. Silence fell. Both of them stood, breathing hard. No time to waste. Ryan turned and kicked the office door open. Inside, Sheriff Hank Dawson sat behind his desk, waiting. Neither side moved. Then Dawson reached for his gun. So did Ryan. The final showdown had begun. The end game. The heavy wooden door slammed open, crashing against the wall with a deafening thud. Ryan and Naomi stormed in, guns raised. But Dawson wasn't in sight. The office was spacious, lined with luxury. A massive oak desk, a sleek glass, bar stocked with expensive whiskey. Art hanging on the walls, concealing dirty secrets behind their gilded frames. None of it mattered to Ryan. Only one thing did. Dawson. And right now, he was in the far corner of the room, one arm wrapped around Naomi's throat, the other pressing a pistol to her temple. Ryan's heart stopped for half a second. Drop the gun. Dawson's voice was cold, but there was a flicker of something. Behind his eyes, panic. He knew things had spiraled out of his control. Ryan didn't move. His eyes locked on Naomi, but his Glock stayed trained on Dawson's chest. Let her go. His voice was calm, lethal. Dawson laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "Let her go? So you can blow my brains out?" His grip tightened around Naomi, the gun digging into her temple. Naomi clenched her jaw, trying not to show fear. But Ryan could see the tension in her hands, the way she fought to stay still. Dawson's eyes never left Ryan. "I know who you are, Calloway," he sneered. "Looked. You up the second you stepped into my city." A smirk curled on his lips. "Ex-CIA, Black Ops, burned out, discarded. How many bodies have you left in your wake? 20? 30? More?" Ryan didn't flinch. He didn't deny it. Dawson chuckled. "And now you're back here, trying to save your ex-wife. That's cute." He shoved Naomi forward slightly, using her as a human shield. "Go on, Calloway," he taunted. "Shoot me." Ryan stayed still. "You want to," Dawson continued, eyes gleaming with twisted amusement. "You're not a good man. You never were. Pull the trigger and this all ends. She's safe. You win." His smirk darkened. "But if you do it, you're just like me." Silence. The room felt frozen in time. Naomi's eyes found Ryan's. Ryan stared at Dawson, his finger tensed on the trigger. Just one shot. One shot would end this nightmare. But then, in that instant, Ryan saw something in Dawson's gaze, a reflection of the man he used to be, the shadow of who he was years ago, the monster he once let himself become, believing violence could solve everything. Naomi didn't say a word, but her eyes spoke volumes. If he pulled the trigger, there was no turning back. Ryan inhaled deeply, and slowly, he lowered his gun. Dawson's brow furrowed, like he hadn't expected that. "So, you're no better than me after all," he scoffed. Ryan didn't answer. He took a step forward. "It's over, Dawson," he said, voice steady. "I have everything. Every document, every dirty deal, every name. The FBI is on their way." Dawson froze. Bullshit. Ryan didn't blink. Naomi saw her moment. She drove her elbow into Dawson's ribs. He staggered, just for a second. But that was all Ryan needed. In a flash, he lunged, seizing Dawson's wrist and twisting it back. The gun clattered to the floor. Naomi grabbed it, spinning around and aiming straight at Dawson. Dawson thrashed, but Ryan slammed him onto the desk, locking his arms behind him. The sheriff growled through gritted teeth. "You think the FBI will believe a guy like you? I have power. Connections." Naomi reached into her pocket, pulling out a small USB drive. She twirled it between her fingers. "We have proof," she said, her voice cold. Dawson's eyes locked. Onto the tiny device, his face paling. He had lost. Outside, sirens blared, flashing red and blue spilling through the windows. Ryan leaned in close. "You don't have power anymore." Dawson's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. He knew it was over. Ryan yanked him up, forcing his arms behind his back, and snapped the cuffs on his wrists. Game over. The door burst open, FBI agents flooding in. Dawson was dragged away, his fate sealed. Ryan and Naomi stood in the aftermath, breathing hard. It was done, but between them, too much remained unsaid. Naomi lowered the gun. Then, without another word, she turned away. Ryan watched her go, and for the first time in years, he wondered if he had truly changed. Outside, the sky over Atlanta began to lighten. The aftermath FBI sirens wailed through the estate. Red and blue lights spun in dizzying circles, reflecting off the once pristine white walls of the mansion, a symbol of power and corruption, now reduced to nothing but the ruins of a fallen empire. Ryan, stood outside, leaning against a wall, hands clasped, watching from a distance as federal agents dragged dirty cops out of the building one by one. Dawson was shoved into the back of a transport vehicle, his hands cuffed, his face twisted in fury. His eyes locked onto Ryan's. Ryan stared back. No anger, no hatred, just quiet, absolute finality. A few steps away, Naomi stood watching too, her gaze never leaving Dawson. As the FBI convoy disappeared into the night, she exhaled deeply. It was over, but there was still one more thing she had to do. She turned to Ryan. Their eyes met. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. Then, Naomi's voice broke the silence. Low, steady. "I need to go home to my son." Ryan nodded. He didn't ask if he could go with her. He simply stood there and watched as she walked away. 1 week later. Morning sunlight streamed over Atlanta's skyline, casting a golden glow across the city's towering glass buildings. Inside USB TV's headquarters, the newsroom buzzed with frantic energy. Outside, reporters crowded the entrance, cameras trained on the doors, waiting. The nation was watching. The FBI's investigation has uncovered a corruption network spanning decades within the Atlanta Police Department. Sheriff Hank Dawson and over 20 officers have been arrested, facing charges ranging from abuse of power and bribery to conspiracy to commit murder. The woman at the center of it all, civil rights attorney Naomi Carter, will be speaking exclusively with us this morning. Naomi sat on a long bench in the waiting room, her fingers gripping the hem of her dress. She wasn't afraid of the cameras. She had faced countless interviews before, but this time was different. This time, she wasn't just fighting for a client. She was fighting for herself. The door swung open. Jordan burst in. "Mom!" Naomi shot up instantly, dropping to her knees and wrapping her arms around him. She felt his rapid breathing, heard the quiet sobs caught in his throat. And suddenly, everything felt real. "I'm okay, baby," she whispered, squeezing him tighter. "I'm okay." Jordan didn't answer. He just held on to her, refusing to let go. When Naomi finally opened her eyes, she saw Ryan standing in the doorway, watching. He didn't step inside, didn't know if he was supposed to. Jordan was the one who broke the moment. The boy pulled back, wiping his face with his sleeve. His voice was quiet but firm. "You saved my mom." Ryan met his gaze. Jordan took a breath. "I guess I owe you a thank you." Ryan was silent for a beat. Then he nodded. "No problem, kid." Naomi stood, smoothing Jordan's hair. She turned to Ryan. "Where will you go?" Ryan shrugged. "Not sure yet." She nodded. "Then, goodbye." Ryan studied her for a long moment. There were a million things he could say. None of them would change what had already happened. So he kept it simple. "Take care." Naomi nodded. Ryan turned and walked out of the building, vanishing into the heartbeat of Atlanta. She watched him go, not knowing if they would ever cross paths again. Then she turned back to her son. It was over, but a new chapter was just beginning. A new beginning. The late afternoon sun stretched across the Atlanta skyline, bathing the small park in shades of fiery orange. Life in the city had returned to normal after the storm that was Dawson. But for Naomi and Ryan, the aftershocks hadn't completely settled. Naomi sat on a wooden bench, watching Jordan play basketball with a group of kids nearby. He was laughing, genuine, carefree. The weight of the past few weeks was no longer etched on his young face. Naomi leaned back, exhaling. Slowly, it was over. Dawson was gone, his corruption exposed. Justice had been served. So why did something still feel unfinished? She sensed him before she saw him, Ryan. He stood just behind her, hands in his pockets, watching Jordan shoot hoops. He wasn't sure why he had come here, or maybe he was. Maybe he just wasn't ready to admit it. Naomi didn't turn to look at him. She simply spoke first. "I thought you left." Ryan shrugged, his voice steady. "I was going to." She gave a small, knowing smile but said nothing. Silence settled between them. Not the heavy, unspoken tension that used to linger between them. This was different. A silence filled with thought, reflection. Ryan kept his gaze on Jordan, then finally spoke. "The kid's good," Naomi nodded, pride evident in her voice. "He's my whole world." Ryan understood what she meant. She sighed, tilting her head back slightly. "I thought things would feel simpler once Dawson was gone." She turned to him then, eyes searching his. "But they don't." Ryan didn't answer, but he knew what she meant. Naomi inhaled deeply, as if gathering the last bit of courage she needed. "I won't deny it," she said, her voice steady. "You saved me. You saved my son." Ryan remained silent. "But I don't need a killer, Ryan." The words hung between them, sharp and unyielding. Ryan's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. Naomi didn't back down. "I need a father for my son." The weight of those words hit him harder than any bullet ever had. His whole life, all he'd known was war. He was good at eliminating threats, at taking down the enemy, but protecting something? Someone? That was foreign territory. He turned back toward the court, watching Jordan sink another shot. A part of him wanted to tell Naomi he didn't know how to be what she needed. Another part of him wanted to say it was too late. But for the first time in years, he didn't want to run. Ryan clenched his fists inside his jacket pockets, drawing in a slow breath. Then, finally, he turned to face her, and he nodded. Naomi's shoulders loosened, as if she had just let go of a burden she'd been carrying for too long. She didn't expect Ryan to change overnight, but at least he was willing to try. She glanced back at Jordan and smiled softly. "He's been asking about you." Ryan raised a brow. "Yeah?" Naomi nodded. "I think maybe you should see him more often." Ryan exhaled, a small, almost imperceptible smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Maybe I could try that." Naomi let out a quiet laugh. For the first time in a long time, she felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel: hope. From the court, Jordan turned, waving at his mother. Naomi stood, giving Ryan one last glance before walking toward her son. Ryan watched her go, something in his expression softening. For the first time in a long time, he let himself believe in something beyond survival. The night settled over Atlanta, but for them, a new beginning had just begun. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Naomi, Ryan, and Jordan's story wasn't just a battle against corruption. It was a story of redemption, courage, and hope. We can't change the past, but we can choose to be better in the present. If you enjoyed this story and want more gripping content, hit subscribe now.